The midday heat pressed against the town like a cast-iron skillet left too long on the stove. Jonah shouldered open the door to Ruth's place, his right arm wrapped around Aiyana, whose knee bandage had already soaked through with red dust and something darker. On the counter, 2 mugs of ginger beer still fizzed beside a sweat-stained receipt. 1 sack wheat, 2 sodas paid in full. Milo Hakes let out a low whistle and jutted his chin toward the pair. Heard you bought her for 2 drinks and a bag of grain? The room erupted like someone had just kicked over a hornet's nest. Jonah eased Aiyana onto the bench along the wall, his voice slow and steady. This is medical care, not a transaction. Aiyana lifted her head, her gaze level, her voice pitched just loud enough for everyone to hear. I am Aiyana, and I agreed to let him take me to a doctor. Nobody bought me. Ruth dropped the towel she'd been using to dry glasses and pointed at the receipt. I'm the one who wrote that invoice this morning, food for an injured person. There's no bride price here. The door swung open again, and Sheriff Calder stepped inside, his hat gleaming with the glare of the Sunday. He picked up the receipt, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his vest pocket. His words landed like nails driven straight into wood. Anyone spreading tales of human trafficking will answer to the law. Right now, the priority is the doctor. In the corner, Milo opened his mouth to add something, but the soft clink of glass against glass served as a quiet reminder. Food and water sustain people, they never measure them. Jonah explained in short, careful sentences, his eyes moving around the room to make sure everyone heard. At Griggs Station, I paid for supplies to transport an injured person to medical care. I paid with wheat for the use of a cart and bandages. I paid for 2 drinks because we had a long ride ahead in the heat. I did not pay for a human being. That's illegal, and it's wrong. He paused, letting the words settle. Miss Aiyana agreed to come with me because there's a doctor here and she needed treatment. That's the whole story. Ruth stepped forward, pulling a duplicate receipt from her apron pocket. I keep carbons of everything I write. This one says the same thing as the one the sheriff just took. If anyone wants to check my books, they're open. Every transaction is recorded. She looked directly at Milo. I was standing right there when Jonah paid. I saw what happened, and I wrote it down. Outside, the wind rolled dust across the square, carrying the scent of dry grass and sun-baked earth. Inside, a story was about to be told in the language of truth. The receipt lay pressed flat beneath the sheriff's hand, the sweat stains already drying into faint brown rings that framed the words like, evidence sealed in amber. 3 hours earlier, the sun had been climbing toward its peak when Jonah spotted the figure crumpled against a stack of red stone slabs in the alley behind Griggs' trading post. At first, he thought it might be a discarded bundle of cloth, but then he saw the hand pressed against the ground, fingers splayed, knuckles white with tension. He approached slowly, making noise with his boots so he wouldn't startle whoever it was. When he got close enough, he saw it was a woman, her dark hair matted with dust and sweat, her face turned toward the wall. Her knee was twisted at an angle that made his stomach turn. He stopped a few feet away and dropped to one knee, keeping his hands visible. My name's Jonah. I can see you're hurt. I'm not going to touch you unless you say I can. Do you understand? For a moment, there was only silence. Then she turned her head slightly, her eyes focusing on him with effort. She nodded once, sweat beading along her temples. I understand. My knee. He moved closer, still keeping his hands where she could see them. I'm going to slide my arm behind your shoulders to help you sit up. Is that all right? She nodded again, and he eased his arm into position, taking her weight slowly. She gasped when her knee shifted, but she didn't cry out. I need to look at the injury. I'll tell you before I touch it. He waited for her permission before gently probing the joint, checking for broken bones. Nothing seemed fractured, but the ligaments were badly torn, and the swelling was already starting. He unwound the bandana from his neck and carefully wrapped it around her knee, applying just enough pressure to slow the bleeding without cutting off circulation. We need to get you to a doctor. There's one in town, about an hour's ride from here. I don't have a cart with me, but Griggs' place has one. Can you hold on while I get us transport? She studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing his intentions against her options. Finally, she spoke. My name is Aiyana. Yes, I can hold on. He hauled her up step by careful step, supporting most of her weight, and half carried her toward the trading post. By the time they reached the door, both of them were breathing hard. Jonah kicked the door open with his boot, and the sudden dimness inside made him blink. Grigg was leaning against the counter, toothpick angled between his teeth, eyes sharp and calculating. He took one look at Aiyana and smiled in a way that made Jonah's jaw tighten. Well, well. You looking to borrow my cart, Jonah? Grigg shifted the toothpick to the other side of his mouth. That'll cost you. Or if you're interested, I could take the girl off your hands for a sack of wheat. Even trade. The words hung in the air like something rotten. Jonah set Aiyana down on a wooden crate near the counter, making sure she was stable before he turned to face Grigg fully. His voice came out flat and cold. I'm not trading a human being. That's not on the table. Not now, not ever. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather notebook where he kept track of his supplies. I've got wheat stored in my barn. I'll give you one sack in exchange for the use of your cart and any bandages you've got. That's a fair trade for goods and services. Write it up. Grigg shrugged and pulled a scrap of paper from beneath the counter, scrawling something that might have been words or might have been chicken scratch. Suit yourself. One sack, then. And let's say 2 sodas for the road, since it's hot. He pushed the paper across the counter. Jonah was about to sign it when Ruth emerged from the back room, her arms full of flour sacks. She'd been restocking shelves and had heard the entire conversation. She set the flour down with a thump and walked over to the counter, her expression unreadable. Let me see that. She took the scrap from Grigg, studied it, then crumpled it up and tossed it into the trash bin. If you're going to make a transaction, you're going to do it properly. She pulled her invoice pad from her apron, the kind with carbon paper that made duplicates, and began writing in clear, deliberate strokes. 1 sack of wheat, 2 bottles of ginger beer, cart rental for medical transport, bandages, and first aid supplies. She filled in the date, the amount, and the terms. Then she signed it at the bottom, tore off the carbon copy, and handed it to Jonah. That's the real record. Keep it. She poured 2 bottles of ginger beer from the cold box, condensation already beating on the glass, and set them on the counter alongside a roll of clean bandages. Milo Hakes had been lounging near the window, half asleep in the heat, but the conversation had caught his attention. He'd only heard fragments: wheat, girl, trade, and his imagination, never the sharpest tool, had started filling in the gaps. By the time Jonah was loading Aiyana into the cart, Milo had convinced himself he'd witnessed some kind of sale. Aiyana looked up at Jonah while Ruth poured the sodas. Her voice was quiet but steady. There's a doctor in your town? He nodded, checking the cart's axle. Dr. Lark. She's good. Knows her way around injuries like yours. You'll be safe there. Aiyana shifted her weight carefully, testing how much pressure her knee could take. Not much. Then I'll go with you. But I want it clear. I'm choosing this. Jonah pulled a folded sheet from his coat pocket, the paper worn soft from being carried for months. It was a temporary medical guardianship form he'd gotten from the sheriff's office a year back when a ranch hand had been too injured to sign his own papers and needed someone to authorize treatment. He spread it out on the counter and filled in the blanks with a pencil stub. Aiyana's name, his own, the date, the reason: medical emergency. At the bottom, there was a clause that he underlined twice. This guardianship expires when the injured party is deemed recovered and capable of making independent decisions. He slid it across to Aiyana. This just says I'm responsible for getting you to the doctor and making sure you're looked after until you're well enough to decide what comes next. It gives Dr. Lark permission to treat you if you're unable to consent at any point. You can tear it up any time you want. It's not a contract of ownership. It's a medical precaution. She read it carefully, her lips moving slightly as she worked through the legal language. Then she took the pencil from his hand and made a small mark at the bottom, her own signature in a script Jonah didn't recognize but respected nonetheless. Ruth produced a stick of sealing wax and a small brass stamp from behind the counter. If you're going to do this, do it right. She melted the wax over a candle flame and pressed the stamp into it, leaving the imprint of an eagle with spread wings, the territorial seal. The wax cooled and hardened in the sun as Jonah loaded Aiyana into the cart, a red circle of accountability catching the light as he clicked his tongue and the horse began to move. Behind them, Milo was already standing, already starting to talk, already getting the story wrong. The ride to town took just over an hour, the cart wheels creaking over the rutted road. Jonah kept the pace steady, avoiding the worst of the bumps, while Aiyana gripped the side rail and focused on breathing through the pain. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? He was a stranger who'd helped her. She was an injured woman who'd accepted that help. Anything beyond that could wait. Dr. Lark's clinic sat at the east end of town, a whitewashed building with green shutters and a sign that read Medical Services All Welcome. Jonah pulled the cart up to the hitching post and helped Aiyana down, supporting her weight again as they made their way up the steps. The door was unlocked, and the inside smelled of carbolic soap and dried sage bundles hanging from the rafters. Dr. Lark looked up from her desk, a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose, and immediately assessed the situation. Injury? Jonah nodded. Torn ligament? Maybe worse. Found her a few hours ago. Lark stood and gestured to the examination table. Let's get her up here. Miss, I'm Dr. Lark. I'm going to need to examine your knee. I'll explain everything I'm doing before I do it. All right? Aiyana nodded, and Jonah helped her onto the table. Lark washed her hands in a basin, then pulled on a clean apron. She worked with steady hands, cutting away the soiled bandage and cleaning the wound while explaining every step. I'm going to press here to check for breaks. It'll hurt. Ready? Aiyana gritted her teeth and nodded. Lark's fingers probed the joint gently but thoroughly, checking the range of motion and looking for telltale signs of fracture. After a few minutes, she stepped back. No fracture. That's good news. But you've got a severely torn ligament, and the swelling indicates you've been on it too long. You'll need to stay off it completely for at least 2 weeks, then gradual weight bearing for another 2 after that. She wrapped the knee in fresh linen, tighter than Jonah's field dressing but not tight enough to cut circulation. Then she pulled out a leather-bound ledger from the shelf behind her desk and made notes in neat, precise handwriting. Date, patient name, nature of injury, treatment provided. Witness present. Jonah's name went in that column. She looked over at Jonah, who was standing by the door with his hat in his hands. She'll need somewhere to recover. Somewhere clean, with access to help if the pain gets worse. Can you manage that? He nodded slowly. I've got a room. She'll have privacy, and I'll follow whatever instructions you give. Lark made another note in her ledger. I'll check on her in 3 days. If there's any sign of infection before then, fever, red streaks, increased swelling, you bring her straight back. Sheriff Calder arrived just as Lark was finishing up, his boots heavy on the plank floor. He'd heard about the arrival from one of the shopkeepers and wanted to assess the situation himself. He pulled a chair over and sat down across from Aiyana. His posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. Miss, I need to make sure you understand your rights under territorial law. Nobody can buy, sell, or trade a person here. If anyone tries, they'll face federal charges, hard time in a federal prison. He let that sink in before continuing. If Jonah here, or anyone else, tries to hold you against your will, or if you feel unsafe at any point, you come straight to me. My office is 2 blocks west of here. Doors always open. Aiyana met his gaze without flinching. I understand. I chose to come here with Jonah. He asked permission before helping me. He's explained that I'm free to leave whenever I want. Calder nodded and pulled out his own small notebook, jotting down her statement. Good. And if that changes, if anything changes, you tell me. I don't care what time it is or what day it is, you tell me. He turned to Jonah. You signed a temporary guardianship? Jonah handed over the form with the red wax seal. Calder read it carefully, checking the expiration clause, then handed it back. This is proper. Just make sure it stays temporary. The moment she's recovered, this ends. Understood? Jonah folded the paper and put it back in his coat. Understood. Calder stood to leave but paused at the door. One more thing. There's already talk starting. Milo Hakes was at the saloon an hour ago, spinning some story about you buying a woman with wheat and drinks. I shut him down, but you know how these things spread. Jonah's jaw tightened. What do I need to do? Calder tapped his notebook. Keep records, keep witnesses, and be ready to tell the truth publicly if it comes to that. Elder Chenoa arrived that evening, just as the sun was setting and the heat was finally starting to break. She'd heard the rumors already, Towns were small, and news traveled fast, especially bad news, and she wanted to see the situation for herself. She carried a woven bag over her shoulder, filled with herbs and tinctures that she'd been gathering for years. Jonah met her at the door, recognizing her from the few times their paths had crossed at market days. She nodded to him politely, then looked past him to where Aiyana was resting on the examination table. "I'd like to speak with her, if that's all right." Jonah stepped aside without a word. Chenoa approached slowly, giving Aiyana time to register her presence. She sat down on a stool beside the table and spoke in a low, measured tone. "My name is Chenoa. I'm an elder from the Eastern Valley. I heard what happened, and I wanted to make sure you're all right." Aiyana's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I'm all right. Jonah helped me. The doctor treated me. I'm choosing to stay here while I heal." Chenoa studied her face. "Good. But I need you to understand something. There are stories people tell because they don't understand. Stories about dowries and bride prices and trades. Those stories don't belong to us. They're put on us by people who see what they expect to see, not what's actually there." Aiyana nodded slowly. "I know. My mother told me the same thing. She said the hardest part of surviving isn't the injury, it's making people see you as a person instead of a story." Chenoa placed a hand on her arm. "Then you also know you don't owe anyone an explanation for surviving. You don't owe them your story, your choices, or your reasons. But if you want to correct them, if you want to speak up, I'll stand with you. So will others." She pulled a small jar from her bag, filled with a pale salve that smelled of mint and something sharper. "This will help with the pain and the swelling. Dr. Lark's treatment is good, but this is what my grandmother taught me. Use it if you want." Aiyana took the jar, turning it in her hands. "Thank you." Chenoa stood, adjusting the strap of her bag. "I'll check on you in a few days. And if anyone gives you trouble, anyone at all, you send word. We look after our own." After she left, Dr. Lark locked up the clinic and walked with Jonah and Aiyana to his house. It wasn't far, nothing in town was far, but Aiyana's knee was throbbing, and every step was an effort. By the time they reached the small wooden structure at the end of the street, she was leaning heavily on Jonah's arm, her face pale with exhaustion. Jonah's house was small, 2 rooms, a kitchen, and a loft accessible by a ladder. He'd cleared out the back room earlier that day, the one with the window facing the cottonwood trees, and set up a cot with clean blankets, a small table, and a chair. He showed Aiyana the space, then pointed to a length of rope he'd hung across the doorway. "This marks the boundary. I won't come in unless you call me or knock. If you need anything, water, food, help with anything, just knock on the wall. I'll hear it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You can leave whenever you want. The door's never locked. If you decide tomorrow that you want to go, you go. If you decide a week from now, same thing. This isn't a prison, and it's not a contract. It's just a place to heal." Aiyana looked around the room, the clean blankets, the window with its view of the trees, the rope that marked where his space ended and hers began. She nodded. "Thank you." A nail had been driven into the door frame to hold the rope taut, a simple, visible marker of respect. Jonah left her there, closing the front door quietly behind him as he went to tend to the horse and put the cart away. Inside, Aiyana sank onto the cot and finally let herself close her eyes. By the next morning, the story had twisted into something almost unrecognizable. Milo Hakes had been holding court at the saloon since mid-afternoon the previous day, buying rounds with money he didn't really have and spinning his version of events to anyone who would listen. "I'm telling you, I saw it with my own eyes." Jonah rolled up to Grig's place with a sack of wheat and 2 drinks. Next thing you know, he's leaving with an Apache woman in his cart. You do the math. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a poorly vented stove. And by noon, half the town was repeating some version of it. Some people added details that Milo hadn't mentioned: gold coins hidden in the wheat sack, a signed contract, a dowry negotiation conducted in whispers. The words bought her circulated like bad currency, passed from hand to hand until no one could remember where it had started. A few people pushed back. Ruth told anyone who asked that she'd been there and seen the real transaction. Dr. Lark reminded people that medical emergencies didn't follow neat narrative rules. But for every person who listened, There were two more who preferred the scandalous version. By the time Jonah walked into town the next morning to buy supplies, people were staring. He felt the weight of their eyes as he walked down the main street, the whispers that stopped when he got too close and resumed as soon as he passed. He dealt with gossip before small towns ran on it, but this was different. This wasn't speculation about crop yields or who was courting whom. This was accusation, dressed up as curiosity. Ruth had heard enough by midday. She'd been listening to the whispers in her own establishment, watching people lean across tables to share the latest variation of the story, and she'd reached her limit. She marched into the back room, pulled the original invoice from her lockbox. She kept duplicates of everything and carried it out to the main room. She pinned it to the board outside her door, the one where she usually posted notices about prices and available goods. In bold letters across the top, she wrote, "This is the only transaction that happened. Read it before you repeat lies." The notice was blunt, uncompromising, and impossible to miss. Within an hour, a small crowd had gathered to read it. Some people nodded, satisfied that the rumor had been debunked. Others muttered that paperwork could say anything and kept whispering. The town split down the middle, and the divide showed no signs of closing. Aiyana, resting in Jonah's back room, heard the noise through the open window. Voices carried in the still air, fragments of conversation drifting past. She pulled herself upright, tested her weight on her good leg, and hobbled over to the window. From there, she could see part of the main street. The people clustered around Ruth's notice board, the way they gestured and argued. She made her way out to the porch, using the wall for support, and lowered herself down onto the steps beside Jonah. He was sitting there, whittling a piece of cedar with a small knife, the shavings piling up at his feet. He didn't look up when she sat down. "People are saying you bought me." He kept his eyes on the wood. "I know." She waited, giving him space to say more, but he didn't. Finally, she spoke again. "I'm going to tell them the truth. My story. My words." He finally glanced over, his expression unreadable. "That's your right. I won't speak for you. If you want to set the record straight, I'll stand beside you while you do it. But I won't put words in your mouth." She nodded, relieved. "Good. Because I'm tired of other people deciding what my story means." Sheriff Calder had been watching the situation unfold with growing concern. Rumors like this had a way of hardening into accepted fact if they weren't addressed quickly. He decided it was time to end the speculation before it became something worse. He posted notices around town, handwritten on official paper with the territorial seal stamped at the bottom. "Public hearing, town square, 2 days hence. Grigg, Ruth, Dr. Lark, Elder Chenoa, and any other witnesses were required to attend. Anyone caught spreading false information after the hearing would be fined." The notice was blunt, official, and backed by the weight of law. People read it and understood. This wasn't a suggestion. The town bell rang 3 times that evening, its echoes rolling over the rooftops and out across the valley. Beneath the bell rope, the hearing notice fluttered in the breeze, stark white against the weathered wood of the post. That night, Aiyana sat at Jonah's kitchen table, a worn ledger open in front of her. The pages were covered in her own handwriting, mixed with occasional sketches, maps of the valley, notes about water sources, records of seasonal flow rates. She traced a line with her finger, following the path of an underground spring from the eastern hills down through the valley. Grigg's been siphoning water from these springs for months. He dug a series of ditches at night and redirected the flow to his own property. Then he's been selling it at triple the normal rate to the ranches downstream. Jonah leaned over her shoulder, studying the maps. "You kept records of all this?" She nodded. "My family's been tracking these springs for generations. We know where the water comes from, where it flows, and how much there should be in every season. When the flow started dropping 6 months ago, I started watching. I saw Grigg's men working after dark. I documented everything." She flipped to another page, covered in dates and measurements. "He's been taking about 30% of the flow. Doesn't sound like much, but in a dry year, that's the difference between crops living and dying. People downstream have been struggling, and they didn't know why. They thought it was just the drought." Jonah sat down across from her. "And you were going to confront him?" She shrugged. "I was gathering enough evidence to take to the sheriff. But then I got hurt. and everything got complicated. Jonah had been storing sacks of wheat in his barn since last season's surplus. The harvest had been good, better than expected, and he'd set aside 30 sacks specifically to donate to Dr. Lark's clinic fund. She'd been running low on supplies and couldn't pay the farmers what they needed for bulk grain. His plan had been to deliver them all at once, but when he'd needed to secure transport for Aiyana, one sack had been the price. He pulled his own ledger from the shelf and showed her the inventory. 29 sacks remaining, each marked with the date it had been stored and a note about its intended destination. I was going to give these to Lark's clinic, but when I used one to pay for the cart, it became part of the story people are telling. He tapped the page. If we can redirect these sacks into a relief program, something public and accountable, it might help offset the damage Grig's doing with the water prices. Aiyana studied the numbers. A relief program would need oversight. People would have to trust that it's being managed fairly. Jonah nodded. Ruth could handle distribution. Lark could manage the medical side. And if you're willing, you could oversee the water records. Make sure no one else is pulling what Grig pulled. Dr. Lark, Ruth, and Elder Chenoa met in the clinic that night to piece together the evidence. They'd each brought their parts of the puzzle: receipts, medical notes, witness statements, water records. Ruth laid everything out on the examination table like pieces of a quilt waiting to be sewn together. We need a chain of custody for all of this. If we're going to prove what really happened both with Aiyana and with the water, we can't leave any gaps for people to exploit. Lark nodded and pulled out her official stamp, the one she used to notarize medical records. I'll notarize each document with a date and my signature. That way, if anyone questions the timeline or the authenticity, we have a paper trail. She began working through the stack, pressing her stamp into wax seals on each page, her handwriting neat and precise in the margins. Chenoa had brought her own records testimonies from families in the Eastern Valley who'd noticed the water shortage but hadn't known the cause. These people have been rationing water for months. Some of them have lost entire gardens. One family had to sell their goats because they couldn't keep them hydrated. She laid out the statements, each one signed or marked by the person who'd given it. This isn't just about Aiyana anymore. It's about a pattern of exploitation. Ruth was already drafting a proposal for the relief fund, her pen scratching across the paper in quick, decisive strokes. We'll need clear rules. Who's eligible, how much they can receive, how often distributions happen. And we'll need public postings, every transaction recorded and displayed so there's no question about favoritism or fraud. She looked up at the others. If we're going to do this, we do it right. Lark pressed her seal into the wax on the cover of Aiyana's water ledger. The words, chain of custody, appeared in neat, authoritative letters, surrounded by the date and her signature. It was more than just a bureaucratic formality. It was a declaration that these records mattered, that they would be protected, that the truth they contained would not be dismissed. The rumors, meanwhile, had an unintended consequence that none of them had anticipated. As word spread, that wheat was supposedly being used as currency and water was being controlled by a single trader, prices began to climb. Farmers who'd been selling wheat at reasonable rates started holding back their stock, waiting to see if the market would rise. Grig, sensing an opportunity, raised his water prices again. Families who'd been getting by on tight margins found themselves unable to afford either resource. A mother came into Ruth's place with 3 children and asked if there was any way to buy half a sack of flour on credit. A rancher tried to negotiate a lower price for water and was turned away. The town, already simmering with gossip, started to feel the pressure of actual scarcity. Aiyana saw it happening and knew they needed to act fast. She made her way to Jonah's barn, moving slowly on her healing knee, and found him checking the wheat stores. If we set up the community fund now before the hearing, we can stabilize prices and cut Grig out of the loop. People need to see that there's another option. Jonah set down the ledger he'd been writing in. We'd need the sheriff's backing to make it official, and we'd need to prove that Grig's been manipulating the supply. She held up her water ledger. I can prove the water part. You've got records of your wheat donations. Ruth's got transaction histories. If we combine everything and present it at the hearing, we can make the case that this isn't just about one incident, it's about a system that needs to change. Jonah considered it, then nodded. All right, let's do it. By the time the harvest fair rolled around 2 days later, the town was a tinderbox. The fair was supposed to be a celebration stalls of fresh produce, contests for the biggest pumpkin, children running between the booths with sticky hands and wide smiles, fiddlers playing on a makeshift stage at the far end of the square. But this year, the undercurrent of tension was impossible to ignore. Milo Hakes had set up near the main pavilion, still talking to anyone who'd listen. He'd attracted a small crowd, people who'd rather hear a scandalous story than face the uncomfortable truth. His voice carried over the noise of the fair, confident and loud. All I'm saying is, it's a strange coincidence. Man pays for a woman with food and drink, and now she's living under his roof. You tell me what that sounds like. Ruth had prepared for this moment. She'd hauled 2 mugs of ginger beer, the same ones from the original transaction, washed and polished until they gleamed, and a burlap sack of wheat to the fair. She set them up on a table right in the center of the square, where everyone would have to pass by. A handwritten sign read, "This is what 2 drinks and a sack of wheat look like. This is what was paid. For transport, for bandages, for supplies, not for a person." She stood beside the display, arms crossed, and waited. People approached cautiously at first, reading the sign, looking at the simple items on the table. Some of them nodded and moved on. Others lingered, whispering to each other. But the display did its job. It forced people to confront the physical reality of the transaction instead of the fantasy they'd been constructing in their heads. Aiyana arrived on Jonah's arm, still limping but steady. She'd insisted on coming, despite Dr. Lark's concerns about putting weight on her knee too soon. She walked up to the table, looked at the mugs and the sack, then turned to face the crowd that had gathered. Her voice was clear, and she didn't raise it. She didn't need to. 2 drinks and a sack of wheat are enough to feed someone. Enough to help someone survive. They are not enough to buy a person. They never were. They never will be. And I was never for sale. She paused, letting the words settle over the crowd like dust after a windstorm. Jonah helped me because I was injured. I agreed to come with him because I needed medical care. I stayed because I chose to. That's the whole story. Everything else you've heard is a lie. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some people looked ashamed. Others looked angry at Milo, at themselves, at the situation. Grigg had been standing near the back, trying to blend in. But Sheriff Calder had been watching him. The sheriff walked over, his hand resting casually on his belt. "Mr. Grigg, I'd like you to come with me. We've got some questions about your water operation and about who started spreading tales about transactions that never happened." Grigg's face went pale. He glanced toward the edge of the square, calculating his chances, but 2 deputies were already moving to block the exits. Calder's voice dropped lower, quiet enough that only Grigg and the people standing nearby could hear. "You're not under arrest yet, but you will be answering questions. And depending on what I find, you might be facing charges." The crowd parted as Calder escorted Grigg toward the sheriff's office, the murmur of conversation rising in their wake. On the table, Ruth turned the 2 mugs upside down, their mouths resting on the receipt. The gesture was silent, deliberate, and everyone understood it. The transaction was closed, the story was over. What remained was the truth. The hearing took place 3 days later, outdoors beneath the sprawling branches of the old cottonwood tree at the edge of town. It was the same tree where disputes had been settled for as long as anyone could remember, its roots deep enough to anchor the town's sense of justice. Chairs and benches had been arranged in a half circle, and a makeshift table served as the judge's bench. Sheriff Calder presided, flanked by the town's magistrate and 2 elected council members. The turnout was larger than expected. Nearly everyone in town had shown up, along with families from the surrounding ranches and